Our domestic spy agency copped a lot of criticism in December after the horrific attack on Bondi Beach for failing to prevent the attackers from committing their crime. But is the answer expanded powers? A bill passed in Parliament last week is proposing just that, forcing suspects to answer questions. Otherwise, they'll face the threat of jail. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris, and you're listening to the Morning Edition from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Today, National Security Correspondent Matthew Knott on the brand new expanded powers of ASIO and the unlikely politicians arguing they amount to an unfair breach of our rights. It's August the 25th. Welcome, Matthew, back to the podcast.
Thanks, it's great to be back.
Can you tell us about this bill that passed in Parliament last week? It expands the compulsory questioning powers of our domestic spy agency, ASIO. So what is in this bill and why is it so controversial?
Yes, I think this really went a bit under the radar. There was a lot happening in the past week of Parliament. Gambling reforms are being passed, huge changes to the NDIS. There was a lot going on. So this didn't get as much attention as I think it really deserved. This has been in the works for a little while, over a year. New legislation which is expanding what's called ASIO's compulsory questioning powers. Now, these are, by everyone's admission, including ASIO, these are pretty extraordinary, unusual powers. They first came in after the September 11 attacks to deal with counter-terrorism. The key fact is that they allow ASIO to call you in and even detain you for questioning. You don't have to be a suspect, and crucially, you have to give answers. You don't have the right to silence that you usually would. It's quite secretive process. There is jail time of up to 5 years if you don't participate in this. And this bill that was before Parliament was expanding out the issues on which ASIO can use these powers. So up till now, they've been able to use them for espionage, politically motivated violence, and foreign interference. This expands it out across a whole range of topics, basically everything that ASIO covers, including threats to the defence system, threats to Australia's border integrity, sabotage, communal violence, a lot of topics. So it's a big expansion. One important thing to know is that what this bill was originally going to do was to make these powers permanent, to really entrench them in law permanently. And that was a big deal because they've had what's been known as a sunset clause, meaning they come up for review and re-legislation every few years, reflecting how unusual and extraordinary they are. The government in recent months took that out. There was a big backlash to that, but the bill with the expanded powers did go through Parliament last week.
Okay, well, tell us about that, because for many years, this bill, of course, had bipartisan support. But this time around, two Liberal senators crossed the floor to oppose the bill. So tell us about that, and I guess if that's significant.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. It's significant and interesting, and we can see in the way that the vote went down for this bill how politics is changing a little bit. A key thing to know about laws like this that deal with ASIO's powers and whatnot, the primary way in which they're really dealt with is through this very powerful and quite secretive often committee known as the PJCIS. But an interesting thing about it is it's only open to Liberal and coalition members, seen as something that's only for what's called parties of government. It's not open to independents or the Greens, etc. And that's the primary form in which these types of topics are dealt with. It's often quite closed door, and then they're voted on without a lot of public debate. This was interesting, this legislation, because yes, two Liberal senators voted against it. They come from the opposite wings of the Liberal Party. One is Alex Antic, who is quite to the far right of the party, and another is Andrew McLaughlin, who is probably one of the most left-leaning Liberal members. He's supported strong action on climate, are very much pro-multiculturalism. And one thing about him, though, is he used to be a lawyer. When he was in state parliament, he took a strong stance on issues like this. And he's been deputy president of the Senate for quite a while, which restricted his ability to vote on certain topics. So he's not in that position anymore. And he told me that he's just had concerns about these rules for a long time, these laws that are kind of often introduced as short-term or emergency legislation that then gets entrenched and expanded over time. He said he thinks it just goes too far, and the balance in the whole debate and the whole legislation has gone too far towards giving power to agencies like ASIO, and there's not enough attention paid to civil liberties. And so he said, yes, he decided to vote against this, and he would expect to vote against such legislation in the future.
And so I guess tell us, what other opposition is there to this bill? Like, what are the main arguments for why ASIO should absolutely not have these powers?
Yes, these certainly are extraordinary powers that everyone acknowledges. They don't really fit within our normal legal understanding of, say, a right to silence, to not answer questions. That's a key part of this, is that you are absolutely compelled to answer, and you can go to jail if you don't. They're very rarely used. They've only been used around 20 times since they were introduced in 2003. And that's actually ASIO acknowledging how broad they are, how unusual they are, because they say this is a matter of last resort, really. You can have a lawyer present, which is important, but the fact they've been traditionally limited to certain topics, specific focuses, shows how unusual they are in our legal system. And an interesting thing about this, I think, is that there hasn't been a lot of mainstream media attention on this legislation, but there's been a lot going on social media, I think, from the left and the right, that shows, how politics is different now. It's not just about what's on the TV and the newspapers, and more concern about power being given to the state. David Pocock, the independent senator who also voted against this bill, he was making clear he's been really flooded by correspondence on this, of people saying this is government overreach. And One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts spoke against the bill and voted against it. The Greens were very strongly against it and kind of led the charge against this legislation. So you see interesting coalitions forming on the right and the left of politics, which could change, I think, the discussion that we have around national security laws.
After the break.
The nature of terrorism is changing, and what we're seeing with some ideologies is changing. It's not so rigid. You see a lot of people who are taking bits and pieces of different extreme views, and they can be very dangerous.
And so I guess, what are the main risks, according to those who are actually opposing these expanded powers? Like, is it that people who have committed no crime, even people as young as 14, could just be detained arbitrarily, for perhaps holding certain religious beliefs or religious or political association? Like, are they sort of envisaging some sort of dystopian scenario where people are just plucked off the street, they're made to answer questions? Is that what they're fearing?
Yes, and sometimes the conversation does go to pretty dramatic scenarios. Some people may say there's kind of conspiracy theories here, or people are exaggerating. That's just something I think that comes with this. When the process is so secret, it's prone to that, because we don't know. We do get updates on the number of times they're used, but we don't really know how they're being used and why. This would only apply to the new expansion of the powers, only applies to adults. Children are covered under some of the others. But yeah, the topics that it goes to could get you into some contentious areas. So the aspects of communal violence and foreign interference, you can think about issues with the Middle East and the situation in Israel-Palestine, anti-Semitism that could come up there, and what are the limits of normal debate, and what is, getting us into dangerous territory. So that's where the opponents of the bill are worried, and the pretty secretive nature of the whole thing.
Okay, well, let's talk about the complete other side, which is the arguments for why ASIO absolutely should have these new powers. Obviously, our domestic spy agency probably cops a lot of criticism for, not knowing enough about the threats that are out there, not protecting us enough. So tell us about the main arguments for why they absolutely should have these new powers.
So ASIO says that while it hasn't used these powers very much, they have already produced important intelligence and important intelligence outcomes. The key reason for expanding them, ASIO says, is that we're just living in a more complicated, complex world, and that national security is much more complicated than it used to be. That, say, after 9/11, we're thinking about pretty traditional threats of terrorism, about terrorist attacks and blowing up buildings and whatnot. What they say is that the national security threats now are so broad. Mike Burgess has said for a few years now, for example, that espionage and foreign interference had overtaken terrorism as the primary concern. So the expansion of these powers reflects that, and that there can be overlapping scenarios. So one example that ASIO gave in the process of this bill being debated was, say, an attack on a nuclear-powered submarine if they found out that could be happening. So they said that can simultaneously be an act of sabotage, an act of politically motivated violence, an act of foreign interference, and an attack on a defense system. That's pretty crucial to think about. One aspect of this legislation specifies defense. AUKUS is huge on that. The fact that Australia is acquiring nuclear-powered submarine technology that so many countries would love to know more about and get access to is a big threat for us and a big opportunity for other nations. I think that's one of the key drivers here as well, is to give ASIO more powers in that defense space to deal with potential spies who are trying to find out about something like AUKUS.
And I was interested in one of the, I guess, expanded triggers for what could prompt ASIO to now legitimately require people to ask questions. And this was, if they are found to be promoting communal violence, that's one of the expanded topics that are sort of, under focus here. And I'm just wondering, the bill was introduced last July. That's before the Bondi massacre happened in December. But is perhaps the thinking within ASIO that this new expanded law, with it, our spy agency will be able to collect the sort of intelligence that may have hypothetically enabled them to stop that sort of horrific attack from happening?
Yeah, I don't think it's been made necessarily explicitly. As you say, these laws were in train even last year before Bondi. But what Mike Burgess always says is that despite all the powers that ASIO has, it's not an all-seeing, all-knowing agency. There's a lot of criticism when anything goes wrong. The Royal Commission now is probing the Bondi attack on whether there were intelligence failures. So this is what Mike Burgess would say, is that the powers need to keep being expanded and updated, that the nature of terrorism is changing. And what we're seeing with some ideologies is changing. It's not so rigid in terms of, say, you're an adherent of Islamic State. You see a lot of people who are taking bits and pieces of different extreme views, and they can be very dangerous. So yeah, it's all part of the context for this.
And just finally, Matt, why do you think that this issue attracts so much interest from the left and the right? Is it something about what's happening in our culture or the globe more broadly now? What do you think's going on?
Yeah, I think we see that people, the public, readers and viewers, are more willing to go and do some of their own research, not so reliant on the mainstream media, not so accepting of the trust of institutions. I think that's something you can see. We see this in America, for example, that you have Republicans and members of the Trump MAGA movement who are very distrustful of what they call the deep state. And there's a libertarian streak on the right that has always been there much more strongly in America than here. But we're not immune to those trends, and we're a bit downstream of, say, what's happening in a place like America. So I think we're seeing more libertarianism on the right. One Nation, interestingly, is dabbling in this space, whereas they don't trust the government. There is some conspiracy elements to, the discourse in which they move. The growth of, say, the Teals is really interesting because, yeah, they're locked out from some of the process on this, and they're much more skeptical, I would say, about just handing over new powers to someone like ASIO compared to the traditional powers of government. So I think if we keep seeing the fracturing and fragmenting of our politics that we have seen, and that seems to be still continuing with the primary vote of the big parties going down, we're going to see more debate and contestability in this space. And I think regardless of what you think of the legislation and what powers ASIO should have, that's good, because some of this is a bit too secretive, or there is not quite enough scrutiny and public attention. So if there's a bit more to and fro and a justification for why extraordinary powers are needed, then I think that would be a good thing.
Well, it's so interesting. So thank you so much, Matt, for your time.
No worries at all.
In other news today, beyond bruised hands and swollen feet, doctors say they're worried about another health risk to Donald Trump, the 10 or so kilos that the U.S. president may have gained, according to medical records, since 2023, meaning he is less than a kilo shy of being classified as obese. 7 foreign nationals from the United Kingdom, United States, Mexico, Poland, and Uruguay are in custody facing significant prison terms after Sydney detectives dismantled what police say are sophisticated overseas child abuse networks. And ahead of key inflation figures being released later this week, a former bank economist has cautioned that falling house prices are unlikely to start turning around until buyers and investors believe the Reserve Bank is poised to cut interest rates. You can read more at theage.com.au or smh.com.au. Today's episode was produced by Josh Towers. Our executive producer is Tammy Mills, and our podcasts are overseen by Lisa Muxworthy and Tom McKendrick. If you like our show, follow The Morning Edition and leave a review for us on Apple or Spotify. Thanks for listening.